Welcome. Today we're going to talk about inverse functions. The first thing we're going to go over is the definition of what it means to be the inverse of a function. If you have two functions, basically to be inverses, when you do the compositions of those two functions, they will be x when you do f of g of x and g of f of x. So for example, if you had f of x equals x plus 2 and g of x equals x minus 2, when you do f of g of x, notice here that means it's f of x minus 2, and notice that will mean x minus 2 plus 2, which means you get x. And then it also means when you do g of f of x, that means I'll go g of x plus 2, which means I'd get x plus 2 minus 2, which is x. So notice when you do g of f of x and f of g of x, that it will be x. If that is the case, then these two are inverses of each other. And when we have inverses, for example, f of x was x plus 2, therefore g of x would be considered f inverse of x, and this is how we write it. That's x minus 2. And notice if we made a table, let's say f of x equals x plus 2, if we made an x y table, notice 1, 2, 3. So 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 2 is 4, 3 plus 2 is 5. Notice if we made a table for the inverse, notice if we put in, let's say we put in 3, 4, and 5, 3 minus 2 is 1, 4 minus 2 is 2, 5 minus 2 is 3. Notice here that the domain and range here for the function switch for the inverse. Notice that the domain of the inverse was the range of the function and vice versa. Now the domain of the function is the range of the inverse. That's what inverses will do. They'll switch. The domain and range will switch from the inverse to the function and vice versa. Now, next thing we're going to do is verify that functions are inverses. So here I have two functions, an f function and a g function, and I want to verify that they're inverses. So what I'm going to do is the compositions. So first I'm going to do f of g of x and see what happens. So that means I'm going to substitute in x plus 7 over 4 for g of x. And now I'm going to put that into the f function. So 4 times x plus 7 over 4 minus 7. Notice 4 times this cancels the 4's out. So you have x plus 7 minus 7. The 7's cancel out, so you're just left with x. When I do g of f of x, that means I have g of 4x minus 7. So that means I'll take the 4x minus 7 and put it in for x. So I have 4x minus 7 plus 7 all over 4. Well, notice negative 7 plus 7 just gives you 4x over 4, which the 4's cancel, and you're just left with x. So notice when I take f of g of x, it equals x, and when I take g of f of x, it equals x. Therefore, they are inverses, because f of g of x equals x, and g of f of x equals x. So basically you need to do the compositions both ways, f of g and g of f, and if they equal x, you know their inverses. Finding the inverse of a function. So we're going to find the inverse of f of x equals 2x plus 7. There's a process to this. The first thing you want to do is replace the f of x with y in the equation. So basically it's y equals 2x plus 7. Then we're going to interchange the x and y's. So we have x equals 2y plus 7. So basically I just switched the x and y. Then I'm going to solve for y. So notice I'm going to take this equation and now solve for y. So I'm going to subtract 7, and then I'm going to divide by 2. So notice I get x minus 7 over 2 equals y. If the resulting equation is not a function, then f does not have an inverse function and the procedure ends. If this equation is a function, the function f does have an inverse. And notice x minus 7 over 2 is a function, so therefore I will just replace the y with f inverse of x, and there is the inverse, x minus 7 over 2. So let's do that again. This time we'll find the inverse of 4x to the third minus 1. So remember, step 1 is to replace the f of x with y. Step 2 is to interchange. So you have x equals 4y to the third minus 1. Step 3 is to solve for y. So we add 1. And then we're going to divide by 4. And then we're going to, in order to get y by itself, we have to take the cube root of both sides. So we have the cube root of x plus 1 over 4 is equal to y. And this is a function, so we'll replace it with f inverse of x. And that is our inverse. Notice that is the inverse of 4x to the third minus 1. So let's do another one. So here we replace the y, the f of x with y. So we get y equals 3 over x minus 1. Then we switch the x's and y's. Then we solve for y. So we have to add 1. So I get x plus 1 equals 3 over y. Then I'm going to get the y off the bottom of the fraction, I'll multiply both sides by y. So I get y times x plus 1 equals 3. And then I'll divide by x plus 1. So notice I get y equals 3 over x plus 1. And this results in a function and that is my inverse. F inverse is equal to 3 over x plus 1. That concludes our lesson today. Any questions, please email me, and hope you guys have a good weekend. Thanks.